Imagine for a moment that you're standing in a cartographer's workshop in 1773, surrounded by the smell of ink and parchment, and before you lies a map unlike any you've seen before. The coastlines are accurate, the mountains precisely rendered, the cities marked with careful detail, but scattered across the interior in regions where villages should be, where roads ought to connect, where human settlement would naturally expand. There are only two words repeated like a warning: empty places. Not unexplored, not unknown territory. Empty. As if something had been there before and was deliberately removed, erased from both the land and from memory. The late 18th century was a peculiar time for cartography. The age of exploration had supposedly mapped most of the known world, yet certain maps from this period contain notations that make no sense within the official historical narrative. In the archives of the British Library, there exists a collection of maritime charts from the 1760s through the 1790s that show vast inland territories across North America, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe marked with variations of the same disturbing phrase. Some read terra deserta in Latin, others use pays vide in French. Still others employ the English empty places or the German leere Gebiete. The translations are consistent, but what they describe remains deliberately vague. Empty of what? Empty since when? And most troubling of all, why would cartographers, known for their obsessive precision and detail, leave such enormous spaces undefined? To understand the true weight of this mystery, we must first immerse ourselves in the world these mapmakers inhabited. Picture the bustling streets of London in 1775. The city sprawls along the Thames with a density that seems impossible for its supposed population of 700,000 souls. Grand stone buildings line thoroughfare after thoroughfare, their architecture displaying engineering sophistication that required armies of skilled craftsmen. The bridges spanning the river are marvels of weight distribution and load-bearing calculation. Underground, a network of brick-lined sewers channels waste with such efficiency that modern engineers marvel at the precision of their gradient angles. The scale of infrastructure suggests a civilization operating at a level of coordination and technical knowledge that contradicts the rustic pre-industrial image we're taught to associate with this era. Walk through the narrow lanes between these monumental structures, and you'll find workshops producing intricate scientific instruments, telescopes with precision-ground lenses, chronometers accurate enough to calculate longitude at sea, surveying equipment capable of measurements down to fractions of an inch. These aren't primitive tools, they're the products of advanced mathematical understanding and manufacturing precision. Yet the official history tells us that most people in this era were illiterate peasants, that education was rare, that technological knowledge was limited to a tiny elite. How then did enough skilled craftsmen exist to build the thousands upon thousands of ornate buildings, the elaborate water systems, the complex mechanical clocks that adorned every major civic structure? Who taught them? Where did they learn? And why, if human population was growing and civilization expanding, would there be empty places at all? The maps themselves provide our first clue. When you examine the cartographic records from 1600 through 1800, a strange pattern emerges. Early maps from the 1600s often show these same regions filled with cities, towns, and elaborate territorial divisions. Maps from the mid-1700s show the same areas with significantly fewer settlements. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, vast territories that were once densely marked have become blank spaces, labeled with those ominous warnings. It's as if civilization retreated, leaving behind emptiness where bustling human activity had once thrived. But retreated from what? And where did the people go? If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. The official explanation, when historians bother to offer one at all, is that these blank spaces represented genuinely unexplored territory, regions where European cartographers simply lacked information. But this explanation crumbles under the slightest scrutiny. Many of these empty places were located in areas that had been continuously inhabited for centuries, regions where trade routes had operated for generations, territories that appeared fully populated on earlier maps from the very same cartographic institutions. The Siberian interior, for instance, appears on Russian maps from the late 1600s, showing numerous settlements and detailed river systems. By 1750, the same publishers were producing maps showing vast blank regions labeled Pustoye Mesto, literally empty place in Russian. Had the Russians simply forgotten their own territory? Had settlements that took decades to establish simply vanished? Consider the accounts of travelers from this period who ventured into these supposedly empty regions. A French explorer named Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville published a memoir in 1760 describing his journey through the interior of North America. He wrote of finding cities of stone long abandoned, their streets still paved with blocks fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed, yet no record exists of who built them or when they departed. He described irrigation systems carved into bedrock, aqueducts spanning valleys on arched bridges that showed no signs of the crude construction methods supposedly available to the indigenous peoples. Most disturbing of all, he mentioned finding fields of bones scattered across miles of territory, as if a great multitude had perished in a single catastrophic event and were left where they fell. D'Anville's account was not unique. Similar descriptions appear in the journals of Russian explorers moving east into Siberia, Spanish missionaries traveling through South America, and British surveyors mapping the interior of Africa. They consistently report the same phenomena: sophisticated ruins far too advanced for the people currently living nearby to have constructed, evidence of massive population loss, and strange environmental anomalies like forests growing on top of what appear to be buried buildings, or rivers that seem to have been deliberately rerouted from their original courses. One Russian surveyor in 1778 wrote of finding an entire city of brick and marble beneath 40 feet of earth, as if it had been intentionally buried or perhaps inundated by some great flood of soil rather than water. The cartographers who marked these empty places were not ignorant men guessing at geography. They were highly educated professionals, often trained in astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. They worked from survey data, travelers' reports, and astronomical observations that allowed them to calculate latitude and longitude with remarkable accuracy. When they chose to leave a space blank or mark it as empty, they were making a deliberate statement. They were telling us something about these regions that couldn't be stated openly in the political and academic climate of their time. But what were they really saying? To answer that question, we need to examine what we know about global demographics during this period. The official historical narrative tells us that human population grew steadily from the Middle Ages onward, with only occasional setbacks from plague or famine. But when you actually analyze the census data, tax records, and civic registries that survive from the 17th and 18th centuries, a very different picture emerges. There are massive gaps in the records, entire decades where population counts seem to have been deliberately obscured or destroyed. In regions where detailed records do survive, they show wild fluctuations, sharp declines followed by impossible surges that would require birth rates far beyond biological possibility. Take the case of the Holy Roman Empire. Tax records from 1650 show a population of approximately 23 million people spread across hundreds of cities and thousands of villages. By 1700, after the supposed conclusion of the 30 Years' War, the population had allegedly dropped to less than 16 million, a loss of nearly one-third. Yet the cities remained intact. The buildings stood, the infrastructure functioned. Where did 7 million people go? The war, devastating as it was, couldn't account for such losses across such a vast territory. And then, mysteriously, by 1750, the population had supposedly rebounded to over 24 million. How does a population recover that quickly from such catastrophic loss? Who were all these new people and where did they come from? The same pattern appears across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Massive population declines in the mid to late 17th century, followed by rapid recoveries that make no demographic sense. And during precisely this period, cartographers began marking vast territories as empty. It's as if something happened, something that killed or displaced enormous numbers of people across multiple continents simultaneously, and then civilization was somehow repopulated or reconstituted, but not everywhere. Some regions recovered, were resettled, rebuilt. Others remained empty, their previous inhabitants gone without explanation, their cities and infrastructure left to decay or be buried by encroaching wilderness. What could cause such a catastrophe? The official history offers piecemeal explanations, wars here, plagues there, famines in other regions. But these localized disasters don't explain the global pattern. They don't explain why areas thousands of miles apart would all experience simultaneous depopulation. They don't explain the evidence of technological regression, the loss of construction techniques and engineering knowledge that seems to occur during this same period. And they certainly don't explain the deliberate erasure of these events from official records, the systematic editing of maps to remove evidence of what was lost. Some researchers have proposed that the mid-17th century saw a series of global catastrophes far more severe than anything acknowledged in mainstream history. There's geological evidence for unusual seismic activity during this period, with earthquakes recorded across Europe, Asia, and the Americas in the 1650s and 60s. There are accounts in various chronicles of the sky turning dark for extended periods, of years without summer when crops failed across vast regions, of great fires that consumed entire cities. One Italian monk's journal from 1661 describes a rain of burning stones that fell from the heavens for 3 days and 3 nights, setting ablaze everything they touched until the very air seemed to be made of flame. Could there have been a cosmic event, perhaps a meteor storm or fragments from a disintegrating comet, that bombarded Earth with extraordinary intensity? Such an event would explain the global nature of the catastrophe, the simultaneous fires and destruction across multiple continents, and the subsequent climate disruptions that would have led to widespread famine and disease. It would also explain why those who survived might have chosen to suppress the memory of such an event. How do you maintain social order and prevent mass panic when people realize that civilization itself nearly ended, that something from beyond Earth nearly wiped out humanity? But there's an even darker possibility. What if the catastrophe wasn't natural at all? What if it was the result of a technological disaster, the remnant of capabilities possessed by an earlier, more advanced phase of human civilization? Look at the architecture that survives from before this period. The massive stone structures, the megalithic foundations, the precision-cut granite blocks fitted together with tolerances that challenge modern construction equipment. Look at the global distribution of nearly identical architectural styles, the pyramids and temple complexes that appear on every continent, built with techniques we can barely replicate today. These aren't the works of primitive peoples with stone tools and wooden rollers. These are the products of a civilization with advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and engineering. What if that civilization didn't simply disappear in some vague prehistoric past? What if it persisted much longer than we're told, perhaps even into the early modern period? What if the empty places marked on those 18th century maps were regions where the final remnants of that older world had once thrived, cities and territories that were abandoned or destroyed during whatever catastrophic event ended their civilization? And what if the people we think of as the architects of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were actually just rediscovering bit by bit knowledge that had been lost? This would explain so much. It would explain why technological development in the 18th and 19th centuries seemed to accelerate impossibly fast, why inventions appeared in rapid succession as if someone were reading from a manual rather than discovering principles from scratch. It would explain the massive, sophisticated infrastructure that supposedly primitive societies somehow constructed, because they weren't primitive at all, but rather the survivors and descendants of a much more advanced culture, gradually losing knowledge with each generation but retaining enough skill to build impressive structures, at least for a time. Consider the evidence of technological regression visible in construction techniques. Buildings from the 1600s often display superior craftsmanship compared to those built a century later. Stone cutting becomes less precise, mortar joints grow wider and sloppier, architectural proportions lose their mathematical elegance. By the mid-1800s, even though the Industrial Revolution was supposedly advancing, many traditional building skills had been completely lost. Modern stonemasons looking at medieval cathedrals or ancient temples often cannot replicate the precision joints and load-bearing techniques without power tools. How did earlier builders, supposedly working with hammers and chisels, achieve what we struggle to match with modern equipment? The answer may be that they had access to tools and techniques that were later lost or deliberately suppressed. There are tantalizing hints in old texts of cutting methods we no longer understand, of chemical processes for softening stone, of acoustic techniques for moving massive weights. These references are usually dismissed as fantasy or allegory, but what if they were literal descriptions of real technologies? What if the empty places on those maps marked regions where the knowledge keepers of these older methods had lived, and when those regions were depopulated, the knowledge died with them? Now consider the systematic nature of the erasure. It's not just that certain technologies were lost, it's that the very memory of them was removed from public consciousness. Maps were redrawn, chronicles were edited or lost, archaeological sites were misidentified or left unexcavated. When evidence of advanced ancient civilizations surfaced, it was explained away, forced into frameworks that made it seem less impressive, less technically sophisticated than it actually was. Oh, they must have used ramps and rope. It probably took thousands of workers decades to build. The precision is just coincidence. But when you actually analyze the evidence with fresh eyes, without the bias of the accepted narrative, a different reality emerges. The empty places phenomenon extends beyond simple cartography. There are vast regions across the globe that show clear signs of former dense habitation, but are mysteriously abandoned when European explorers arrive. The American Midwest contains thousands of massive earthwork complexes, geometric formations, effigy mounds, astronomical alignments, covering far more territory than could have been built by small, scattered tribes. Yet by the time extensive surveys were conducted in the 19th century, the builders were long gone, and the few remaining indigenous peoples had no oral traditions explaining who made the mounds or why they left. Carbon dating of organic materials from some of these sites suggests they were still in use in the early modern period, possibly as late as the 1600s, yet there's no record of the transition from occupied to abandoned. The same pattern appears in Australia, where Aboriginal oral traditions speak of the time before the forgetting, when their ancestors lived in great stone cities and worked metal and sailed vast distances across the ocean. These accounts are typically dismissed as myth, yet megalithic stone circles and extensive fish trap systems dot the Australian landscape, requiring sophisticated engineering and massive coordinated labor to construct. When were they built? Who built them? And why would their descendants forget such achievements unless something catastrophic disrupted the transmission of cultural memory? In Siberia, the permafrost occasionally melts to reveal structures that shouldn't exist. Stone buildings with advanced metallurgical workshops, ceramic kilns capable of temperatures that require precise fuel-to-oxygen ratios, even what appear to be the remains of glass manufacturing facilities. These finds are usually dated to periods when the official history claims the region was inhabited only by nomadic hunters. How do you explain glassmaking among people who supposedly had no permanent settlements? How do you explain metallurgical knowledge among cultures that allegedly worked only with bone and stone? The answers become clearer when you consider the possibility that there was never a simple linear progression from primitive to advanced. What if civilization has risen and fallen multiple times? What if the catastrophe marked by those empty places was merely the most recent in a series of collapse events? What if humanity has repeatedly achieved high levels of technological sophistication, only to lose it all in global disasters, whether natural cataclysms, wars, diseases, or cosmic events, and then had to slowly rebuild from the ruins? This would explain the legends found in virtually every culture of a golden age that came before, a time when the gods walked among men, when great works were accomplished, when knowledge was greater than it is now. These aren't fantasies or religious allegory, they're cultural memories of actual historical periods when civilization reached heights we've forgotten. The gods were simply the survivors of previous iterations of advanced human culture, their superior knowledge and capabilities making them seem divine to later generations who had lost that knowledge. The depopulation marked on those 18th century maps might represent the final death throes of the most recent advanced civilization, the last cities falling silent, the last knowledge keepers dying without successors. The cartographers who marked those regions as empty were documenting not just a lack of current inhabitants, but the recent loss of something far greater, entire sophisticated societies that had thrived until very recently, then vanished with shocking speed. And here's where the conspiracy deepens. If such a catastrophe occurred in living memory or just a generation or two before, why isn't it prominently featured in the historical record? Why are there only scattered hints and oblique references? The answer may be that those who survived and came to power in the aftermath deliberately suppressed the truth. Perhaps they feared the psychological impact of people knowing how close humanity came to extinction. Perhaps they wanted to erase the memory of the old civilization to consolidate their own power and prevent comparisons that would show their own societies as inferior. Or perhaps they wanted to monopolize whatever knowledge and technology could be salvaged from the ruins, keeping it secret from the general population. Look at how history was systematized and standardized in the 18th and 19th centuries. National academies were founded, official histories were written, earlier chronicles were collected, edited, and often corrected to fit the new narrative. Archaeological finds were interpreted through the lens of approved theories. Anything that didn't fit was explained away, locked in storage, or quietly destroyed. We're taught to think of this as the triumph of rational scholarship over superstition and myth. But what if it was actually the triumph of a particular narrative over contrary evidence? What if the empty places on the maps were physically real and historically documented, but the explanation for their emptiness was too disturbing to be allowed into the official story? Consider what we know about the immediate aftermath of major disasters, even in modern times. After catastrophic events, there's often chaos, confusion, and deliberate manipulation of information. Governments control narratives. Media shapes public perception. Inconvenient truths are suppressed in the name of maintaining order. Now imagine such information control in an era when literacy was limited, when printing presses were controlled by authorities, when the common people had no way to verify or challenge official accounts. How easy would it be to rewrite history itself, to edit out the most disturbing truths, to create a sanitized version of events that wouldn't provoke questions or panic? The technological oddities of the period support this interpretation. The sudden appearance of advanced innovations in the late 1700s, steam engines, precision manufacturing, chemical industries, is usually credited to the genius of individual inventors. But many of these inventors came from privileged backgrounds with access to old libraries, private collections, and esoteric knowledge. Were they truly inventing from scratch, or were they rediscovering principles from manuscripts salvaged from the ruins of the older civilization? The speed of technological development suggests the latter. Real innovation is usually gradual, building slowly on previous work. But in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, entire new fields of knowledge seem to emerge fully formed, as if someone had found an instruction manual. And what about the demographic recovery? If populations crashed as severely as the evidence suggests, where did all the new people come from? The official explanation involves slightly higher birth rates and lower death rates as conditions improved, but the mathematics simply don't work. To repopulate entire regions in just 2 or 3 generations would require birth rates far beyond what humans are biologically capable of sustaining. Unless the repopulation involved migration on a scale we're not told about, or unless there were surviving populations kept in reserve somewhere, or unless the actual timeline of events is radically different from what we're taught. Some researchers have proposed that the chronology itself has been manipulated, that years or even centuries have been inserted or removed from the historical timeline to obscure the true sequence of events. This seems fantastical at first, but when you examine how dating systems were standardized, how calendars were reformed, how early modern historians backdated events without solid documentation, the possibility becomes more plausible. If you can control the calendar and the historical narrative, you can make events seem more distant or more recent than they actually were, creating false continuity or hiding uncomfortable gaps. The empty places on the maps may have been the truth leaking through, moments when cartographers couldn't completely hide the evidence of recent catastrophe, couldn't fabricate settlements where none existed. They marked those spaces as empty because they were empty, recently emptied, catastrophically emptied, emptied of populations and civilizations that had stood there within living memory. And then, over time, as the official narrative hardened and became accepted truth, those honest notations were removed. Later maps filled in the blank spaces with speculative details or simply extended the margins of neighboring regions to eliminate the gaps. The memory of the empty places faded, relegated to obscure archives where only dedicated researchers would stumble upon them. What we're left with is a palimpsest, a manuscript where earlier text has been scraped away and overwritten, but traces of the original remain visible to those who know how to look. The true history of human civilization may be like that, layer upon layer of rise and fall, of achievement and catastrophe, with only fragments of the older layers preserved beneath the sanitized surface narrative we're taught. The cartographers who warned about empty places were giving us one of those fragments, a glimpse of a truth too disturbing to be spoken openly, but too important to be completely erased. And perhaps the most disturbing implication is that we might be heading toward our own empty places moment. We build our civilization on foundations we don't fully understand, using principles rediscovered from older knowledge we pretend never existed. We strain the planet's resources. We push technological systems to their limits. We create dependencies on complex infrastructures that could fail catastrophically. And if another global disaster struck, whether natural or technological, would our descendants mark our cities on their maps as empty places, warning future generations about regions where a civilization once thrived and then mysteriously vanished? Would they suppress the memory of what we achieved and what destroyed us, just as the truth of earlier catastrophes seems to have been suppressed? The cycle may be far older and deeper than we imagine, human civilization rising and falling like waves on an ocean, each crest thinking itself unique and permanent, unaware of all the crests that came before and crashed into ruin. The maps with their warnings about empty places aren't anomalies or mistakes. They're rare moments of honesty, brief admissions that something terrible happened here, that these lands are empty for reasons we don't fully understand or don't dare explain. They're whispers from our ancestors trying to warn us about truths that the official keepers of knowledge wanted forgotten. And when we see those warnings, we should ask ourselves, what else has been forgotten? What else has been deliberately erased? And what might we be forgetting right now about our own civilization's true nature and fragile foundations?